Welcome back to today's installment of our discussions of theology. We're still thinking about what is called theology proper, the doctrines related directly to God, speaking of God's character, his attributes. What is he like? We've been discussing for the last several videos now the so-called communicable attributes. Most recently, we spoke about the issue related to grace. Today, we're going to wrap up the communicable attributes by talking about three closely related doctrines. First of all, let's talk about the doctrine of God's justice. When we speak of God's justice, it may be arguably one of the least favorite, one that people like to overlook, because we don't like the idea that God is just. Well, sort of we do. We like the idea of God being just when it applies to other people who've wronged us. We just don't want God to be just as it relates to us and our particular sins. But when we speak of God's justice, what we mean to say is that God always acts in accordance with what is right. Now, notice I say there that it is what is right. I don't use the word fair. We use the word right. See, fairness is about what is right in the eyes of the beholder. I think it's fair. You might not think it's fair. Justice speaks of what is right always. What is right in the eyes of the judge and what's right in the eyes of the law. It's not in you or me. It's in justice itself that determines what is right and wrong. And so God, in light of all of his other attributes, determines perfectly what is right. His omniscience, he knows all things, so he knows what is right. His omnibenevolence, he always does what is right. His holiness, he must behave in a way that is always correct and right. And so God always does what is right. And so justice and the idea of righteousness are closely related to one another. The Hebrew term for righteousness in the Old Testament, tzaddik, the Greek term, dikaios, was all related, all connected to Old Testament and New Testament, the concepts of righteousness, or even in one sense, holiness. But let's look at just a couple Bible verses before we move on and talk about another doctrine. Let's look at Isaiah 45, verse 19. God is speaking, I did not speak in secret in a land of darkness. I did not say to the offspring of Jacob, seek me in vain. I, the Lord, speak truth. I declare what is right. Or another Old Testament text, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32. Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verse 4. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. And so God always does what's right. Now, of course, we could ask, so what is right? The answer would be whatever corresponds to God's character. God determines what is right because it fits his attributes, his character. Conversely, we could ask, what is wrong? And the easy answer here is whatever contradicts God's character, whatever goes against what God has declared, or whatever it is that God displays. Now, theologians do like to talk more specifics, of course. And so we talk about justice, and we talk about two different types of justice. One fancy label is what's called rectoral. The rector is the king or the power, the controller. Rectoral justice. This speaks of God's justice in terms of the governance of the universe in determining what is right and wrong. Hosea chapter 14, verse 9 might point us in this direction. Hosea 14:9. Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. And so that's rectoral justice. God declaring, governing the universe, declaring what is right and wrong. When we talk about the doctrine of salvation, you might look at the book of Romans chapter 3, verses 25 and 26. This is connected to it as well. Romans 3, 25 and 26. I'm trying to figure out where to pick up the middle verse. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be both just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. And so rectoral justice, determination of what is morally right, and God sets that in motion. You might also, though, speak of distributive justice. That is the idea that God then gives everyone what they deserve, whether that's rewards or whether that's punishment. Two more of a quick Bible verses, and then we'll move on to another doctrine. The book of Micah, Micah chapter 7, verse 9. I will bear the indignation of the Lord because I've sinned against him until he pleads my cause and executes judgment for me. He will bring me out to the light. I shall look upon his vindication. Or 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. God distributing what is right and wrong to those who deserve rewards or punishment. Closely related is the doctrine of God's wrath. Because God is just, he must deal not only with the good, but with the evil. He must execute wrath. He cannot merely overlook sin for all of eternity, as some people would hope. Now, let's admit there are times when he does withhold his wrath at this time, waiting for a future day or moment when he'll unleash it. But one day he will unleash it. He must deal with it because he is just. Justice requires recompense for good or for evil. And so part of that is wrath. And so let's think about it this way. What's the basis of God's wrath? Remember, anything that opposes God's character is wrong. And therefore it also opposes God's person. Now, that does not violate God's omnibenevolence. He's good, but God must deal with what is wrong. And God hates all things that are antithetical to his character. This is not just merely a matter of, oh, that's wrong. It's against God's character. Book of Psalms. Psalm chapter 11, verse 5. The Lord tests the righteous, but his soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. Or the book of Proverbs. Book of Proverbs, chapter 6. Let's read from verse 16 through verse 19. There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil, a false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers. God hates those things. They're against his character. And then Romans 1:18, the wrath of God has been revealed from heaven. And then goes on and discusses that greater depth. Now, here's a common error that often comes with the doctrine of wrath for modern Christians. Many Christians hold to a false sense of dualism. That is, they like to think of God of the Old Testament as being the God of wrath, and the God of the New Testament as a God of love. That's unbiblical and it's indefensible. You find God's grace and mercy scattered throughout the Old Testament. And you find God executing wrath in the New Testament. Just one example before we move on. John chapter 3, the chapter. Everybody likes to talk about John 3:16, for God so loved the world. But also in the same chapter, Jesus has this to say: whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Sounds familiar, right? John 3:16. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him. And so we must see and think of and ponder and understand God in light of both testaments, New and Old. They're both true, and they both contain pictures of God's various attributes. His wrath is one such thing. The last attribute we want to discuss this morning as we wrap this all up is the attribute of God's jealousy. The Bible says in multiple places, for example, Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, and again in Exodus chapter 34, verse 14, that our God is a jealous God. Now, today we've got a very tainted view of what jealousy is. Oh, he's so jealous of her. He's green with envy. That's not what the Bible means when it speaks of God's jealousy. The jealousy that we mention or mean when we speak of God being jealous, again, must relate to God's character. It must be right. It must be sin-free. It must be completely dedicated to his glory. Isaiah chapter 48, verse 11. This is God speaking, and it speaks of God's jealousy. For my own sake, For my own sake I do it. For how should my name be profaned? My glory I will not give to another. God is jealous of his glory and will protect it at all costs. See, in humans, jealousy is wrong. Now, not all jealousy in humans is wrong. For example, we're told to be jealous for God's glory and honor. But jealousy typically in humans is selfish. It's selfish in that we want to protect what's ours, but it's not just ours. But when we speak of God's jealousy, he is perfect. He does deserve all the glory, honor, and fame. And for anybody else to try to take it is to steal what is God's, and so he protects it. He keeps his own, he protects his own glory, he protects his own people. And thus, at the end of this session, it's good for us to remember that God's jealousy is connected to God's wrath. Sin is an assault on God's character. It's a violation of who he is. It's a violation of his person, and therefore it deserves punishment, and it deserves punishment equal to the offense. And so if a sin is against an infinitely holy God, it means it's an infinitely evil act. And what does it deserve? Infinite punishment. And God's sense of justice demands that he deals with it, right? His wrath is how he deals with sin. And his jealousy assures us that he will, for he can do no other. Now, while these doctrines may be scary for some, they ought to bring us great assurance. Because what God has declared, God will do. What he has promised, he must accomplish. And so our hope is not in that, I hope he doesn't catch me. Our hope is in that he will do what is right always. It also means that we must do what he's told us always. And since we don't, we must do one thing he's told us, and that is call upon the name of the Lord, and we will be saved. His promise is our hope. It's based on his character and not our own. Thank goodness he's God and we're not.